Hey everyone. This is just a video to respond to something which Gemini said not too long ago. This is not the first time that I've made a video in response to something Gemini has said or done. I think this is at least the third time, actually. But Gemini, for those who don't know, is a gentleman who runs a YouTube channel called Pixel Musement. He's best known for his series Ancient DOS Games, and in general, I would say he's best known for people who are into DOS game, PC gaming, especially DOS gaming of the 1980s, 1990s era. And so I estimate there's a lot of overlap with between his viewers and my viewers. That's why I mention him as someone whom I suppose that most of my viewers will probably know. I assume that most people who watch my videos probably know who he is as well, because his videos, I think his audience demographic probably overlaps with mine significantly. So, as I say, Gemini is best known for his series Ancient DOS Games. That's sort of been his flagship series since forever. But he had a few others, and he's tried to diversify a bit recently by starting a new series called, he pronounces it double NRG. It's written NNRG like that, which stands for No Nostalgia Retro Gaming. But it's pronounced double NRG. Get it? Because it's like energy. That's cute. Yeah. So the idea behind double energy is that, as you know, the title says no nostalgia gaming. Because it features Commodore 64 games, and Gemini is not that familiar with the Commodore 64 scene, just as I am not. I mean, I never had a Commodore 64 as a kid. I haven't played that many Commodore 64 games. I mean, I know several. I've seen several Commodore 64 games, but I don't really have the encyclopedic knowledge of Commodore 64 games that I have of DOS games. So it's kind of new territory for me, and I guess for most of his viewers as well. But Gemini recently made a video stating that Double Energy hasn't been as successful as, for example, Shovelware Diggers. So he, some time ago, I made a video noting that he ended his series Shovelware Diggers, which was about going through an old shovelware CD of DOS and Windows games. Um, and that series did pretty well, it had a lot of viewers. But Gemini is sort of, I guess, a little disappointed that his new series, Double NRG, and there's another one called Bootleg Gaming, which focuses, I think, on console games, but not on the well-known console games, but on bootlegs, like bootleg games made for consoles. And neither have been as successful as Shovelware Diggers. And in a recent video, Gemini noted that. A lot of people say they're not that interested in these series because they're not familiar with the platforms. They're not, they're as opposed to people who know a lot of things about DOS games. There are not that, a lot of his viewers are not that familiar with Commodore 64 games, and so the games don't hold that much appeal for them. Now, Gemini concluded, and I understand why he made this conclusion. I guess it's an easy conclusion to reach, but he sort of got the idea that. This means that people are watching his videos not to learn about new games, but for nostalgia reasons. They want to see the old games that they already knew. Um, there is some truth to that. I've noticed that on my channel as well, because I kind of did the same thing with my channel. I wanted to use my YouTube channel to highlight, obscure games that people might not know about. But obviously, most people just want to see their favorite games, But the most views go to videos for very well-known games like the Sierra games. If I played LucasArts games like Monkey Island, I'm sure those would get a lot of views as well. Um, or other very popular games. Generally speaking, the more popular the game, the more views the videos get. And if you like playing obscure games, if you like highlighting little known games as I do, that's nice. I mean, nothing wrong with that, I would say, but you can expect to have a lot fewer views. And in my case, I'm not bothered by low view counts. I'm not too upset if my I've said in the past, I'm not really upset if my videos have low view numbers. That's not bad. Like I'd rather have a core small audience of people who actually like my videos rather than having millions of people who are just here because I'm sort of catering to the masses. But for Gemini, it's a bit different because he does this as as a living. Like he basically, he has a Patreon and stuff. He makes most of his living, like his actual means of making a living, are from his online presence, from his videos and things like that. So he kind of needs the views. I don't need the views. I don't make a living from this. I've never made any money from my videos, but Gemini does, and so he kind of has to do what's popular a little bit. So again, he concluded that people are not watching Double NRG and bootleg gaming because people just want to see nostalgia videos. They want to see videos for games that they already know. And again, like I said, I think there's some truth to that. But what I want to talk about in this video today is something, let's say something more cultural. Because what Gemini did notice, and I think a lot of other people noticed as well, shovelware diggers also mostly highlighted games that are not very well known. Even if you really like DOS games, even if you were a DOS gamer and you really are familiar with obscure DOS games, you probably don't know a lot of the games that Gemini featured in shovelware diggers. Everybody knows shareware games like Commander Keen and Duke Nukem and those kinds of things. Like they're really famous shareware games. But there are a lot of shareware games on these shovelware CDs that most people don't know. And yet people still enjoyed watching those videos because they were still DOS games. And I think there's something to be said for, again, like I said, what I'm going to call the culture of the PC as a platform. I think it was Marshall McLuhan who was famous for saying that the medium is the message. Actually, I think his book was called "The Medium is the Massage," which was actually an unintentional typo. But basically, he was saying that the communication that people get from any kind of medium, whether it's film or television or music or books or whatever, there's an inescapable sort of cultural, social, mental, psychological association that people have with that medium that you cannot get away from. It doesn't matter whether a movie is a comedy or a drama or a horror movie or a war movie or a romance movie or whatever. Just the act of watching a movie sort of has a certain psychological effect on the viewers that will never be had from reading a book, for example. And vice versa. Reading a book has a certain effect on your brain, which a movie can't have. So I do believe that there is sort of an inherent effect that you get from playing DOS games that you do not get from playing Commodore 64 games. And so I think part of what's happening here, part of why Gemini's new series are not so successful, is because he is mostly known for DOS games. Most of his viewers watch his videos because they're DOS gamers interested in DOS games. And it doesn't matter what kind of Commodore 64 games he plays. It's not necessarily about the games themselves. It may be that as well. That may be a factor. But I think also it's just the fact that playing games on the Commodore 64 is kind of intrinsically a different experience from playing them on DOS, if that makes sense. I'm going to try to show some examples of what I mean to make it clear, because I know things are usually better understood with examples. But again, there are just certain associations with things that you can't get away from. A good example maybe is music genres. If somebody listens to, let's say somebody listens to heavy metal music, like that's their genre, that's their go-to genre of music. If somebody always loves to listen to heavy metal music, that probably says something about them psychologically. Like there are certain cultural associations that you can't get away from. Or if somebody likes to listen to hip hop, or if somebody listens to classical music, Beethoven and Bach and whatever, or if somebody listens to jazz music or whatever, all these things, they're not just musical tastes. People would like to think this is just musical taste, but it's not. There is a certain sort of cultural and social, there's a culture. Music has culture within it. People who really listen to heavy metal a lot will tend to have, they're not all going to be the same, of course. There is some diversity within these scenes, but people who listen to heavy metal will tend to have a certain sort of mentality that informs them and that sort of drives them to that kind of music, and the same with most types of music. So, again, the same is true with gaming. People who are more drawn to DOS games have a certain sort of just have a certain sort of personal preference or taste that drives them to enjoy watching DOS games in a way that doesn't resonate as much when they're watching a Commodore 64 game or an NES game or an Amiga game or whatever. So I think what we're seeing here is kind of an example of going back to using an example of myself, kind of referencing something that I did with my channel recently. A few months ago, I floated the idea of doing ASMR videos on my channel. That idea did not go over well with viewers. People kind of said, "Yeah, I'm not really too keen on the idea." I mean, most people said at best, "I'll watch them just out of curiosity," but nobody really enthusiastically said, "Yeah, it's a great idea, good idea." So I think there's something to be said for understanding your audience and staying true to your core audience. My core audience is people who like to watch DOS videos. And that's fine. That's cool because that's something I like doing. I like doing stuff, I like DOS games, obviously. And so it's something I enjoy doing. If it weren't, then okay, I'd probably have to rebuild the channel, do like a whole perestroika on this YouTube channel. But no, that's something I'm okay with doing. That's kind of what I've always done with the channel. So it's good to stick to that and not try to branch out too much because that is my core audience. So my kind of advice to Jim and I would be, if he's watching, I don't know if he watches my videos. I don't think he's ever commented on my videos, but I'm assuming he's aware of who I am. I'm not a big celebrity on YouTube, but within the field of DOS gaming, I think most people know who I am by now. I think most people have at least seen some of my videos. I think I have some presence within this very small sort of subculture of DOS games. So I think most people in the subculture have probably at least some awareness of me. So Jim and I might watch my videos. So if he's watching, my advice to him would be, understand that your core audience is probably composed of DOS gamers, people who want to see DOS games. It's not that you're picking the wrong games to play. It's not that Double Energy is featuring the wrong games or bootleg gaming, or it's not that you need to change your choice of games. It's just that the whole sort of feel of the platform that you're demonstrating is not necessarily resonating with your core audience, with most of your subscribers. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with what might be an instructive example, which is Life and Death. Now, this game is a game that resonates with me for many reasons. Yeah, I know where the game does this at first. This version of the game, when it boots up first. There we go, that's better. So, this game resonates with me personally because it just happened to be one of the very first computer games that I ever played in my life. Those of you who know me probably know that I played this on an Apple II GS and not on a DOS computer. So I didn't know this version as a kid. I had the Apple II GS version, which is way better because it has much more colorful graphics, it has better sound. But beyond that, beyond looking better, it's the same core game. So I'll go ahead and get myself signed in here. And I'm not going to play through the whole game, but the point is that, if you've seen this game at any point in your life, you probably understand this is not the kind of game you could really make for the Commodore 64. Not at this, funny enough, there's actually an Apple II sitting here on the, I didn't even intend for that, but now that I think about it, it's actually kind of apt that there's an Apple II sitting here on this, I think that's an Apple II. I think this is supposed to be an Apple II, I assume. Or is it? Actually, I'm not sure now. I always thought it was an Apple II, but now I'm not sure. Anyhow, this game is mostly known for its DOS release. But if you look at the platforms that it was released for, I think the list is kind of instructive. It did have a version on the Mac, which I think is significant. I'm gonna come back to the Mac later in this video. There were also versions for the Amiga and the Atari ST, and of course the Apple II GS, which is the version that I keep mentioning because I'm an Apple II GS fan, because that was my first home computer. But those were all kind of high-end machines, and they had limited market penetration compared to the Commodore 64 and the Apple II. The Apple II and the Commodore 64 were kind of the best sellers. Those were, and the PC. I mean, basically the holy trinity, if you will, of home PCs has always kind of been the Commodore 64, the Apple II, and the IBM PC. Those were the three machines that really defined home computing throughout the 1980s and kind of going into the 1990s as well a little bit. Um, a lot of people would say, why didn't this game get released on the Commodore 64 or the Apple II? Because it's just too sophisticated. I mean, it's not by today's standards, it looks very primitive, but it is kind of a complex game. There is a certain amount of stuff going on here which would have been difficult to render on a Commodore 64, I think. I'm not sure that it would have been impossible on a Commodore 64. I think it would have been possible to do, but certainly it would have been kind of stripped down. Um, that's not to say that there were not versions of similar games made for those kinds of platforms. I'm going to go ahead and get out of this game. I didn't want to actually show off. This is not a Let's Play video. I'm not actually playing through these videos. I'm just kind of showing off the games to kind of display them and kind of talk about them a bit. So that's Life and Death. And I'm going to start off with that idea, the idea that a lot of the games that are the most interesting are games that require a certain level of hardware ability to realize that game. If you're into the demo scene, there are wonderful demos which show off, different ways that people kind of stretch the capabilities of these machines, different ways that people get the most out of these tiny computers with 64 kilobytes of RAM and 1 megahertz processors and limited graphic. I mean, I love the demo scene. Don't get me wrong. I love demos. But we have to accept that there are certain fundamental limits of these computers. And I am kind of skeptical about how this game could have been realized in the Commodore 64. That having been said, though, I do want to admit that there are counterexamples. Like, for example, a game which I have featured on my channel in the past is the Oak Flat nuclear power plant simulator. And I want to run it now because I want to just show you what it looks like on the PC, just kind of give you an idea of how it looks on the PC. So let's see. So I press 5 to start the simulation. And this is what it looks like. And I made a video about this game on my channel many years ago, probably close to 20 years ago. I think it was one of my first videos. It must be getting close to 20 years by now. And again, I'm not going to go into in depth. Like, I'm not going to show really how the game works, but you get the idea. You see a lot of numbers here, and you can press things like F3 to adjust the primary PCP. As I believe it's not PCP here is not the drug. It's not angel dust. It's the primary coolant pump, and the SCP is the secondary coolant pump. And I believe the ECP is the what is that? The extra. What does E stand for here? External, I don't know, I don't remember. But basically, you can type things like, pump rates, so you can punch in numbers like this. You press F10, you have more possibilities here. You can press F7 to give in text commands. And is there a way to see like a list of, no, that wasn't it. Can I do help? No, there's, how do I get a list of commands? Or is there a way to get a list of commands in this game? Maybe you have to read the manual, I don't know. But anyway, you can see there's a fair amount of detail here. There's a fair amount of data that's being represented. We have a 5x4 grid of core stats down there, so that's 20 data points right there. And then up top, what you have up top there those are status lights, so those are like warning lights. And then, of course, on the right, you have the diagram showing the actual, it's like a pictogram of the nuclear power plant. And if I do this now, is it going to start? Yeah, there we go. Wow, it started reacting pretty quickly. Hold on, can I do this now? Okay, now we can cool it down. Okay, we saved it in time. But anyway, you get the idea. It looks fairly primitive. I mean, you can see it's just using text characters. There are no real graphics here. It's just using graphical text characters to show that pictogram on the right. So in this sense, it's a very primitive kind of game, but let me go ahead and quit. If I say command quit, will it quit? Yes, it's quitting. Okay. Oh, I got 7 points. That's nice. And I generated 1,018 megawatts of electricity without even trying. Wow, that's cool. It's a pretty powerful power plant because I generated 1,000. So basically, I generated like a little, just over a gigawatt of power, or not power, but technically, hmm. Actually, now that I think about it, that doesn't make sense because power is a rate. So it should actually be not megawatts, but megawatt hours. Maybe they mean megawatt hours? Because megawatts is not actually, it's not a quantity of energy, it's a quantity of power. And power is actually a rate of energy consumption. You can't generate 1,000 megawatts of power in aggregate. You can generate 1,000 megawatt hours. Okay, anyway, sorry, I'm getting distracted here. Let's go ahead and get out of that. That wasn't what I wanted to talk about. So you've seen this game now on the you've seen the DOS version. That was the DOS version of that game. Now let me go ahead and run a Commodore 64 emulator. If I can do so. I actually haven't been very busy with Commodore stuff for a while, so bear with me, please. I'm going to need to figure out how to do all this stuff. All right, here we go. So I've got WinVice running, and I'm going to go ahead and switch to it. There we go. This is WinVice here. Oh, the window's a little too big. Hold on, let's fix that. Yeah, the proportions of this window are not well suited to the resolution that I'm recording at. That's unfortunate, but okay. All right, let's go ahead and roll with this. So let's see. I'll go and attach a disk image. It used to be, Vice used to let you just auto boot D64 images. That is not the case anymore. You have to actually manually, after you attach the disk, you have to actually manually enter the commands load *81. Which is not the end of the world, but it's a bit odd. I don't know why they removed that feature. It used to be you could just say auto boot and just choose the D64 file, and it would just auto boot. Now, at least with this version, I haven't figured out how to do that. You have to actually, let me turn on warp mode. The disk drives of the Commodore 64, I believe it was the model 1541, if I remember right. They were, of course, notoriously slow. And all right, now it's ready. We can just say run, and it should run. Here we go. It's running. Yeah, I'm not really worried about the high scores right now, but thanks for the warning. Okay, so let me turn off warp mode here. Okay, let's check the instructions quickly because I believe that, yeah, so here we go. So this is basically the list of commands. This is basically the list of what you can do in the game. And then there's some information here. Okay, that's nice. Yeah, pressing plus basically turns things on. All right, let's go ahead and press 2 to start simulation. There you go. This is the simulation. Now, right off the top, you can very clearly see things are more limited here. You don't have the pictogram, obviously, so you don't see that picture kind of showing the different parts of the reactor. But you also don't really have. Sorry, my screen just went blank for a second. I think it might have been a recording glitch. Okay, we're back now. We had, what was it? I think I said 20 data points before. Now we have just 4x3, so only 12. So we have just over half of the data points that we had before. They're empty because it's not, hold on, let me press plus. There we go. Now it's actually turned on. So you can see it has data points, but the whole thing with the all the details that we had, a lot of them have been stripped away, and now all we have is, again, if I press H. Can I press H? There we go, ready for power up. Now if I press H, these are all the commands I get. That's basically it. So, there's not necessarily a lot that we can do here. In fact, what can we do here? If I say 2 to open the primary flow control valve, It's not doing anything. I actually don't know how to do this properly. I'm not familiar with this version of the game. It is clearly not... hold on. If I press F7, it says show diagram screen, but it's not showing it. Okay, I might... Okay, I might have no idea what I'm doing. I clearly have no idea what I'm doing with this game. But you get the idea. You can see it's considerably more primitive than the DOS version. So people look at stuff like this and they say that you couldn't make these kinds of more intelligent, more complex games on platforms like the Commodore 64. That's true to some extent, but I think in many cases it was just for a lack of trying. I think that in many cases people didn't really try to make these kinds of games for the Commodore 64 and Apple II because people just assumed that you couldn't. But I think that there are things that you could do which would have been pretty impressive if people had just bothered to do them. It's just that nobody did. As an example, let me go ahead and switch to another emulator here. Let me go ahead and show you folks something else. Something that you've probably seen before if you are at all a fan of my channel, because what I mostly play is... hold on. I know it's blank. That's because I have not loaded anything yet. Give me just a moment. You're looking at an NES emulator, and an NES emulator that's not running anything yet. But let me go ahead and start something. There we go. This might look familiar. Yes, Virginia, there was an NES version of King's Quest V. And I don't believe that this game was made by Sierra at all. So it's branded by Sierra because, King's Quest is obviously originally a Sierra property. But as far as I know, this version of the game was made by, obviously by Konami, which is, not bad. I mean, I have respect for Konami because they made some great games back in the day, obviously. They didn't just make Contra, they made lots of games. And yeah, the original sort of concept and design is from Sierra. But... the actual game, once we start getting into it... If we complete King's Quest V, I'll go ahead and say... Actually, what happens if we say no? Let me go ahead and actually say no and see if it... Let's actually play the intro here. Oh, my castle. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna skip this. Again, my goal here... Wow. Okay, here we go. This is the actual game. So now the game starts. So you move Graham around with the D-pad, and he walks around as he does. And if you press the buttons, you've got at the top there, you've got the usual look at and interact and talk things, and you've got, inventory and stuff like that. Hold on, I think I'm pressing the wrong buttons here. What button do I use to... that is not what I want to do. Okay, I actually don't know what... Hold on, if I do this, does this look at Cedric? Yes, it does. Cedric waiting patiently for Graham. So you can see the The fidelity to the source material is impressive. The music sounds really good. I mean, obviously, it's more primitive than the ad lib music that was on the DOS version of the game. But listen to those birds chirping. No, they stopped, but there, there you go. See that? They went to the trouble of reproducing the sound of the birds chirping. The music is a really impressive recreation of the music from the original. But more than anything, like really more than anything, I'm just impressed at how they adapted the control scheme. This is a game that's you're basically playing with a D-pad and two buttons. And they've done a fairly admirable job. Yeah, they've done a fairly admirable job of adapting this game to what was, after all, a much more limited platform. I mean, don't get me wrong, the NES was a great platform, but obviously it was not designed for games like this. It's not a good platform for these types of adventure games in general, and yet they've done, you know, this is not one of the best versions of King's Quest. I'm not saying that I'm a huge fan of it, but I do respect the level of effort that went into trying to adapt the game to a platform that was absolutely not made for it. That is something that I really enjoy when people kind of reappropriate hardware to do things that it was never meant to do. So if you can do stuff like this with the NES, there's not necessarily a reason why you couldn't have done something like Life and Death on the Commodore 64. It would have been a more primitive version of Life and Death, but you could have done it. I think that it could have been done. It's just people didn't really want to do it because they didn't feel that they could have done it with the same level of fidelity. And this is kind of a recurring theme. You know, a lot of the games that were sort of definitive of the DOS era um, were games that would have been difficult to make for a Commodore 64. I think also, sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but I think also time was just a factor here because the Commodore 64 came out around around the mid 1980s. Um, but most of the DOS games that people remember fondly today came out of the 1990s when computing was already significantly advanced along. In the 1980s, I mean, DOS PCs existed in the 1980s, but what was DOS gaming back then? It was pretty primitive. It was like, the original Ultima. What were popular DOS games in the 1980s? The original Ultima, maybe stuff like, the original Wizardry, stuff like that, like really, really very old RPGs and things like that, which people don't really remember today. PC games that people remember today tend to be things like, obviously, Doom. If it's not Doom, then it'll be stuff like, I mentioned the adventure games from Sierra and LucasArts, like Monkey Island, King's Quest. But that all came a bit later. King's Quest V came out in 1990. And that was a time when the Commodore 64 was already pretty much outmoded. The Commodore 64 was already old news, and the Apple II in 1990, like those computers were already close to being obsolete, if not totally obsolete. So I think one of the factors that we're seeing here is that DOS games really came into their own in the 1990s. And so computing had a chance to get more advanced than it was when the Commodore 64 was still a hit. Um, so it's partly that. It's partly that DOS games came out at a time when the state of the art was more advanced, more sophisticated. And so it's part of these old machines like the Commodore 64 and the NES were not as capable of rendering games, of doing things with games. But my point, and the point that I'm going to keep coming back to, is that I think there was just sort of a culture surrounding these machines that inspired people to do certain things, to make a certain type of games for them. Because most Commodore 64 games were action games. Commodore was very informed by, in the 1980s when the Commodore 64 came out, Commodore was very informed by a time when games were still kind of shaped by the arcade industry. So, arcade games, which were about fast-paced action and getting a high score and things like that. It was that sort of gaming mentality that informed a lot of what went into the Commodore 64. And that's why a lot of Commodore games. That's one of the reasons why a lot of Commodore games were like that. And again, that's just a cultural thing. Of course, there were adventure games in the Commodore 64 as well. There were strategy games on the Commodore 64. There were puzzle games in the Commodore 64, but those tend to be the exception. Overall, there was a stronger emphasis on action games for the Commodore 64 as opposed to the PC. And I would claim that the PC enabled people to be a little bit more creative with their games, because not only were PC games a little bit more, I don't know if I should say intelligent. Maybe I hope it doesn't sound too elitist or snobbish of me if I say, we DOS gamers, we had more intelligent games. I'm not trying to be snobby like that, but I do think that PC games were a little bit more intelligent than Commodore 64 games overall. And that was, it was part of the technology, but it was also part of the culture. And you can see examples of that in the types of games that people made for DOS. One example, which actually is kind of relevant, is I think it's the last game that Jim and I did on Ancient DOS games, which was SimAnt. SimAnt is, of course, best known on the PC, as far as I'm pretty sure it's the best known on the PC. But SimAnt did actually have an NES release, and if you look at it, actually, let me go ahead and show it. Let me go ahead and switch over to that. If I was like a real video maker, I would do all kinds of editing here. Like I would just cut the video and do a cut to me playing SimAnt on the SNES. But I'm way too lazy to do any kind of video editing, so I'm just gonna. I usually just do my videos live. So you're gonna see me doing all the stuff as I do it. I'm just way too lazy to do proper video editing and do all these cuts where I eliminate the in-between stuff. So this is an SNES simulator that you're looking at now. Let me go ahead and load SimAnt. It is early summer. Time for a new beginning. Time for the ants' mating flight. Oh boy, this is going to get spicy. Oh, look at those ants mating. For months, okay, you know what? This actually looks pretty cool. Like it's pretty nice, and I think this kind of reflects. Okay, let me go. Let me go and start the game. Let's just do a full game. Oh, I think I pressed the wrong button. These 4 buttons on the SNES controller are pretty overwhelming to me. I just can't. I can't handle 4 buttons, man. That's too much for me. I have trouble with the 2 buttons on the NES. If I press, there we go. That started the full game. So this is SimAnt on the SNES. Now, I do have some buttons here, and I can actually click on these, or I guess not click. Click is probably the wrong word, but I can, change these, this behavior triangle here. And I can change the cast triangle here, and I can do, I can change this kind of thing. And I can look at some graphs here. Okay, there's no data to graph right now, but you get the idea. I think you understand the point here. The point here is basically, it's a nice looking game. Like this game actually looks really nice. The graphics are really sumptuous. The graphics are really colorful. The music's pretty cool. But the interface is stripped down. Now, I would posit, and people might disagree with me on this, but I would posit that the reason why the interface is stripped down is not because of technical limitations so much as because of a cultural factor at work. people who play console games tend to be more interested in action, and so the audience of the SNES, the people who actually bought and played SNES games, are people who probably were more interested in action, and they wouldn't be as interested in an in-depth simulation. Now, again, I might be being elitist about this. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Maybe some of those people really did want in-depth simulations, but I would posit that people who really wanted an in-depth simulation wouldn't have gotten the SNES version of the game. They would have gotten the DOS version of the game. So this is kind of getting at what I'm trying to say here. What I'm trying to say is, yes, there were technical limitations. Obviously, excuse me. Obviously, the Commodore 64 was not as technically capable a machine as the IBM PC in some ways, but it's not just about the technical limitations of the platform. It's about the culture of the developers and the gamers that surrounded these platforms. So what I wanted to do in this video is just show a handful of games that just kind of occurred to me spontaneously. I'm just going to go ahead and kick out of this and go back to DOSBox now. Here we go. Here's DOSBox. Just as we left it. And I wanted to show just a kind of a handful of DOS games, which I think sort of illustrate what I'm talking about. One that just came to mind for whatever reason, I don't know why, maybe just because I was always too intimidated by it to play it, was TBS, which stands for Tactical Battle Simulator. Now, here we can choose the mission. So there are 3 missions here. This one is between easy and average difficulty. This one is the same difficulty, and this one is really hard difficulty. Let's just go ahead with Alien Encounter. And I find it interesting that a DOS game here is actually notifying us that a newer version of the game is available. How does it know? Because this game is obviously not connecting to the internet. It can't check the internet. It mentions CompuServe there, but I don't think that it is connecting to CompuServe. So how does it know that a newer version of the game was released? They must have somehow programmed into this game that it had an expiration date, and that in April 1994 they would release a new version of the game, which I find kind of interesting. But anyhow, let's go ahead and here we go. This is the game. Now, I have no idea how to play this game. One reason I think why this game sticks out in my memory is because it was just too difficult for me. It's too complicated for me. And if I say identify unit, there you go. It identified that unit. Can I say, let's see, can I say weapons lock on? Okay, now I'm going to have to choose what to lock on to. Oh, I guess something is, am I approaching something? I'm assuming the big circle, like that thing with the green and blue and red circles around it, is probably my ship. And that little yellow thing on the right, is that a... Oh, that's interesting. I pressed escape to get out of that screen, and only then did I realize that it said press escape to fire weapons. Did it actually fire some weapons? I don't know. Is something happening, or I don't know. I cannot discern whether something's happening. I never got good at this game, but okay. Technicalities aside, let's forget about the technicalities of the game. You can see that this is the kind of game that would probably never have been made for the Commodore 64. First of all, the resolution is quite like this is not 320 by 200 resolution. This is obviously a higher resolution in DOS that we're seeing here. So resolution plays a big part. Obviously, for games that need to present a lot of data, as this game is doing, higher resolutions are helpful, because if you have only 320 by 200 resolution, that's certainly high enough for games that just show graphics. That's more than enough for games that show graphical images, which means most Sierra adventurers from that time, and also shooters like Wolfenstein or Doom. But that resolution is not good for presenting a lot of data, as this game is doing. So the ability to have really high resolutions is key for enabling this style of game. As you saw on the Commodore 64, the Commodore version of the Oak Flat nuclear power plant simulator is considerably stripped down from the PC version, from the DOS version. And I think that just has to do with if nothing else, it has to do with the resolution. Again, there's only so much that you can fit onto a screen, and the fewer number of pixels you have, the less information you can present on a screen. The higher resolution, the more data you can pack onto the screen. So it's partly a matter of resolution. I think we can't discount that. But again, as I say, there's also, I would assert that culturally, there was probably less interest in a game like this on the Commodore. I might be wrong, actually. What do you think? Would Commodore 64 gamers have been interested in playing? Is this version notification going to come up like every couple of minutes? That's insane. That's one thing that I actually do like about old games is that they don't always bother you about newer versions of the games being available. I think this is the first DOS game I've ever seen which actually does this, which actually nags you to upgrade to the newest version. This is something that I do not like about current gaming, and I'm not liking this game is doing that. I seriously think this is the only DOS game I've ever seen in my life that keeps nagging you to download the latest version. bad bad reflection there in my on my part. That's something that scores negative points, to be honest. Not that anyone really cares. I'm sure that nobody's gonna care that I subtract a couple of points from the game's score for nagging about the newest version. But you understand what I mean. I don't think that this is the kind of game that would have interested Commodore users. But am I wrong? Like, what do you think? Again, if you had a Commodore 64 back in the day, or if you were in that scene, do you think the Commodore gamers would have really wanted to play a game like this? I feel that the answer is no, but I might be wrong. This game actually reminds me of another game. There's another game called Begin, which was also for DOS. I think the full title is Begin: a tactical starship or space combat simulator, something like that. I played that game a lot when I was a kid. It's similar to this. I mean, it has a similar premise, but it has a very different interface. Yeah, I don't know this game at all, sorry. But the point is that you could have more advanced games on the PC, but again, if I get, hold on, let me quit. Let me just quit out of this, because I think we saw. This may sound like a stupid question, but are you sure you want to quit this game? I think the comma should go after the word question, not after the word but. Pressing enter means yes. There we go. This game is from 1993. And again, the graphics are kind of primitive for 1993. I mean, again, like the benchmark for me is always King's Quest V. King's Quest V was the first game that I played, and I think one of the first major PC games to have 256 colors, which gave it almost photorealistic kind of graphics in some spots. And that came out in 1990, as I mentioned. This game is 3 years later, so this game was actually already kind of primitive for its time. In 1993, this game was already kind of primitive looking, but still, this is a good, well, like 10 years. When did the Commodore 64 come out? Let me check before I go on. Let me do a quick check. I'm going to do a quick status check. I believe it's 1984, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So before I say something wrong, let me check. Let me quickly check. Commodore 64 was released in 1982. Oh, the Commodore 64 was released in 1982. It's even older than I thought. Okay, so this game came out 11 years after the Commodore 64. Now, you may think that this game looks pretty primitive, and I mean, okay, admittedly it is. Like, it's not a technically very impressive game, but still, 11 years, more than a decade. That's a very long time. That was a very long time in that history of computing, and I really can't emphasize what enormous strides the computer industry made in those 11 years. So again, I think what we're seeing is partly just that DOS benefits from time, because most of the well-known DOS games came out later. They came out well after the C64 was released. But there is also a certain amount of, as I say, of cultural sort of stuff happening here, which gave people the ability to be a little bit more creative. One game that kind of sticks in our memory as being just a little bit creative, and I don't really know why, because it's not necessarily there's nothing too super special about it, but there's this game, Miner VGA. It's a game of rare earths mining. So basically, yeah, here you go. This is the game. So basically, you can walk around the town, and the goal is to go down into the mine and just start mining. Hope that you find stuff. Hope that you find some gold or silver or platinum, which you can then sell for money. Now, again, the game is not very technically impressive from a graphical perspective. The graphics are very simple. The audio is just basic PC speaker, beeps and squawks. But first of all, you can see the resolution is very high. It has a really high resolution, which enables the game to theoretically enables the game to do things that that the C64 could never have done. Although, in all fairness, it's not really doing much with that resolution. I mean, yeah, you can see the resolution is very high, but it's not necessarily doing much with that very high resolution. But that aside, I think that just this style of game, just this sort of look and feel of game, is something that you wouldn't have seen on the Commodore 64. I mean, there may have been similar games made for the Commodore 64, I'm not aware of any, but they would have had a very different sort of style associated with them. They would have had simpler controls, simpler mechanics, and what makes this game interesting is the, various things. One of the things that makes it interesting is this huge list of keys. And it's not even that huge. I mean, it's what, like about a dozen keys? It's not even that many keys, but again, this is a certain level of complexity, let's say, which you probably wouldn't get from most Commodore or Apple II games. But yeah, and yet, having said that, let me quit. Let me go ahead and how do I quit? What's the quit option? Oh, X. X is to quit to DOS. There we go. What I do find interesting is if you look at this game's documentation, the game's from 1989, but if you look at the kind of intro here, this game was originally implemented in a Commodore PET in the late 1970s as a text-only style game. So I do want to kind of say that in all fairness, because I've been saying that the PC had smarter games and it had more sophisticated games, but this game was based on a PET game from the 70s. So I would have liked to have seen that game. Actually, I should have probably looked it up. It might be available online. I didn't check. But again, this is kind of an exception. This is an example of, the Commodore PET version of this game would be an example of a more sophisticated kind of game that's not focused on action. But I think back then all games kind of had to be that way because games weren't really capable of being action games in the 1970s. I think computers did not have much ability to render, real-time graphics. So probably more games had to be more text-based and more turn-based and more strategic rather than action-based. But still, I feel like this is the kind of game that's more likely to be made for DOS. And I say that realizing that it's based on a Commodore PET game, but still, I feel like this game is, when you look at it, when you look at someone playing it, it feels like the kind of game that could only be made for DOS. It feels like the kind of game that wouldn't be made for Commodore, Apple, Amiga, whatever. You wouldn't see an Amiga version of this kind of game, most likely. Someone could have made it, but most Amiga games were not like this at all. They were not this this sort of strategic sort of, kind of game. They were more action-oriented. Other examples, there's no end of puzzle games. I don't need to, there are tons and tons of puzzle games for DOS and other platforms like that. One game that I do personally enjoy, which I have shown in the past as well, is Loader Larry, which is one of many games made by Solo Software, which was a very productive, very prolific software company for these kinds of puzzle games. Now, the concept here is very simple. You're this guy walking around, and you have to get to the exit. So you're going to kind of stack boxes around like this, and try to get to the exit. And I'm going to need those boxes up in the upper left there, because otherwise I'm going to get stuck if I jump over that, if I jump into that hole there. So what I'm going to do is hop up here. And then I can go ahead and put that over there. And I will need to take these boxes with me, because I will need a way to get over here. And there you go. That's the first level of Loader Larry. Cool. So it's a puzzle game. It's a very simple puzzle game. I'm aware that puzzle games like this existed on pretty much every platform. This game is kind of reminiscent, now that I think about it, of Sokoban. Sokoban is that box pushing game. Similar kind of concept. You're a guy in a factory and you have to move around boxes. But Sokoban is that traditional. You've probably seen Sokoban type games. If you don't know what it is, it's hard to. I'm trying to think of a good way to describe it. It's that kind of game where you can only push boxes. You can't pull boxes. So basically, you have to push boxes in such a way that you can escape the level. Very typical sort of game style that's very copied today, but the original sort of game that made that style of game popular was called Sokoban, and it's about a guy in a warehouse who just needs to push the boxes in the warehouse around so he can escape, or alternatively to organize the boxes so that the boxes can be organized in the proper space in the warehouse. And there are a lot of variations on that game. There are countless knockoffs and clones and spin-offs of that game that have been made over the years, but it's a typical sort of game. And there were Sokoban clones on pretty much every platform. They existed for the Commodore 64 as well, but again, I go back to my core point here that those kinds of games didn't really define the platform. Everyone knows Sokoban pretty much, but it wasn't a definitive game for those platforms. This is the kind of game that likely would not have been a hit on the Commodore 64 or the Apple II. Now, of course, there were similar. How do I quit this now? How do I quit? How do I get out of here? Do I need to start the game? Oh, I press Q. Okay. I guess I need to start a puzzle before I can quit. Anyhow, let's see if I say continue and then exit to DOS. There you go. Now I've exited to DOS. One game that I did want to show, because this is a game that I actually played when I was a kid. Hold on, I need to get back to my Commodore 64 emulator. And I need to switch the window. Well, here we are again. It's always such a pleasure. This time I want to start. What do I want to start? I want to start. That's right. The game is called The Factory. So, just as last time, do load star 81, and I'm going to turn on warp mode in the... Oh, I didn't need to. It's already loaded. This is a smaller game. Hopefully it will run fairly quickly without too much waiting. I just present this game because this is actually a game that I had in school. When I was in primary school, we had a Commodore 64 in the classroom, and it had a fairly limited selection of games, and this was one of them. And this is a game that It's a game that I personally feel nostalgic about, but it's also kind of a good example of something that I want to say, if it ever wants to load. It's going to show up. There we go. Hessware, created by Sunburst Communications, copyright 1983. Would you do just the color? No, thank you. One moment, please. All right, here we go. The factory room by Eric Grubbs. So, okay, there we go. So I'll go ahead and say make a product. I'm just going to quickly show you kind of the premise of this game, how this game works. So let's say make a product. I'll start with easy. This game's actually pretty hard. It's surprisingly hard. Okay, your challenge is to make that. I'm trying to think what that is in the middle. I mean, it's obviously, is that supposed to be like a square in the middle, or is that? I can't tell. Let's assume that it's a square. So the way that this game works is basically you have three types of machines. You have punchers, stripers, which just draw stripes, and rotators. So what we need to do here is obviously punch a hole. And okay, so we can do either a square or a circle. I'm going to assume it's a square. It's got to be a square and not a circle. And yeah, just one punch because there's just one square. And then we need to rotate the thing 45 degrees. There we go. Now I'm done. Let's go ahead and run the machine now. And there we go. You made the product correctly. Cool. Try this product again. No, let's try something different. Another product, yes. Let's do medium this time. That's a little too easy. Okay, this is significantly harder now. So I'm going to need to, let's see, what do we need to do? So first we start off by making I'll start off with a stripe. Is that a thin, I think that's a thick stripe. And then we'll do a punch, and those are circle holes, and there are obviously three of them. Cool, so now we've got that stripe done there. Now we need to rotate the thing 45 degrees, and then we just need to do a stripe, which I think that's a medium stripe, looks like. All right, let's say we're done. Let's give this a try now. Let's see, is that gonna work? It's a thick stripe going on there. It punches the holes, it rotates the thing, and does a medium stripe. Hey, we made it correctly, cool. So, this is a kind of cool game. I had a lot of fun with this game as a kid, but what demographic do you think this game is made for? Obviously, it's a game made for children. It's a children's game. And I mean, adults can have fun with it as well. Like I said, hard mode gets pretty hard. Let me show you on hard mode. It actually, that's a bad example. It's actually pretty easy. It always just has one circular hole in the middle and then just three stripes. That's a bad example. Some of these get quite a lot more difficult than that. But okay, anyway. But you get the idea. This game also had an Apple II release. And that kind of figures because the Apple II and the Commodore 64 were very popular in schools. Like I said, we had a Commodore 64 in my school. The Apple II is even more associated with primary school education in American schools in the 1980s. In general, the Commodore 64 and the Apple II were very popular for educational software. So that's why you had a lot of puzzle games like this, which were mostly aimed at kids. Whereas stuff like Loader Larry is more puzzles for adults. Solo software. I mean, they're family friendly. You could play them with your children, but they're more targeted at adults. And a lot of the puzzle games that are kind of classic, really classic puzzle games are stuff like Robot Odyssey, which I featured on my channel before, and its companion program Rocky's Boots. And I think there was also another companion program called Gertrude's Secrets, if I remember right. All those were aimed at kids, though, even though Robot Odyssey is so difficult, actually, it would stump most adults, honestly, towards the end. But the point is that these were games aimed at children. They were made for the educational market, and as such, they were mostly made, the expectation was they were mostly for Apple II and Commodore 64 computers, even though they did have DOS versions. So, in terms of puzzle games, there were a lot of puzzle games for the Commodore and Apple computers, but they tended to be for kids. They tended to be something you'd see in schools, not something made for the home market for adults to play at home. So when we're talking about more, as I snobbishly say, more intelligent kinds of games, those tended to be more on the PC because they were more seen as like machines for adults. So the PC was, it was a business computer, right? It was supposed to be something that you'd have in your office. It was made for business people, for office workers. But in terms of its games, it tended to feature more mature games because it did target an adult audience. That might actually be one of the reasons why Now to think about it, it's probably one of the biggest cultural reasons why the culture of DOS gaming was so different, because it tended to feature more games targeted at adult audiences. And I don't mean adult audiences as in like pornographic, not featuring sexual content, but adult audiences as in, not children. Um, Obviously, there were exceptions. There were lots of children's programs for DOS as well. But in general, the IBM PC was seen as more of a serious business machine. And so they made more games targeted at adults. And there is no shortage of examples of developers who made really successful games for more mature audiences, games that were kind of creative, like in the shareware market, there were games like, games by Nels Anderson, like Superfly, or games by Everett Kaiser, like Snarf and Sherlock, which were they were very creative. I mean, Superfly and Snarf had action elements. They were basically kind of action games, but they were not action games as you would see on the NES or the Commodore 64. They were action games with a more strategic sort of bent, if you want to put it that way. But it wasn't just that. There were games like, gosh, let me go back to DOSBox again, and let me show you. I think I featured this game also on my channel before as well, but I'll go ahead and take us back to Aldo's Adventure. Now, this game, hold on, make the window bigger here. Now, this is one of the, for me, this is one of the definitive shareware action games of the 1990s for DOS. This is Aldo's Adventure. Now, again, very clearly, you can see the game has the advantage of a very high resolution. It uses a really high graphical resolution, which just would never have been possible. It would not have been technically possible on the Commodore 64 or the Apple II. Just would never have happened. Just, you didn't have high-res graphics like this on those platforms. And that much higher resolution enables a certain sort of game feel, a certain sort of... Again, I don't even know how to describe it. There's just a certain sort of mentality that goes into a game like this, which you wouldn't really see on a Commodore game, or you likely wouldn't see on a Commodore game. Like again, the medium is the message, right? There's just something about this type of game that makes it feel more likely to have been made for DOS, even though it is transparently based on Donkey Kong, even though in terms of the gameplay, it is obviously very heavily inspired by Donkey Kong, because you're obviously playing someone who's meant to visually invoke Mario, and obviously the whole barrels coming down thing is very evocative of Donkey Kong. So in terms of the gameplay, it is very strongly inspired by Donkey Kong, and yet it's still something that you would never have seen in an arcade, and probably wouldn't have seen for consoles like the NES. I mean, the fact that there's no audio for starters, that's a big factor. Like a game with no audio would have been pretty much unimaginable in arcades or on consoles. And this kind of resolution was usually not used in those contexts either. Whoops, I died there. I jumped right into a barrel. But it's not just the graphics or the sound or the lack of sound, even though that is part of it. There's just second time in a row, a barrel just came out of that chute just as I was all gone. There you go. That was Aldo's Adventure. Do you see what I mean? Obviously, the resolution plays a part. The fact that it's really super high resolution plays a part in why that game feels the way it does. Obviously, the fact that they didn't bother to put any sound effects or music in the game says something about the mentality that went into the game. Obviously, this is, again, not the kind of mentality that would have made a console or an arcade game or a Commodore 64 game. And yet, it's not just that. There is something about the look and feel of the game that just says DOS, that just works in a way that you wouldn't have seen on any other platform. Another example, which I personally like, is the Pack Rat This is a very simple kind of game. This is a really simple sort of platformer game. This one actually does have some audio. Whoops. Need to get used to the control. The controls in this game are really, wow. The controls in this game are quite. This pack rat accelerates very quickly. Okay, but that aside, again, do you see what I mean? This game at least has sound in it. And the graphics resolution is lower than an Aldo's Adventure. But it's not about that. It's not about the resolution. It's not about the sound effects. It's partly the level design. Like, the level design feels more, it's like it's more focused on the mechanics of the game than on good level design. I think that's probably an example of one thing, like part of the, again, what I call the DOS culture, if you will. I think DOS gaming culture was more focused on gaming mechanics. It was less focused on, making a game with cool graphics and sound. Like, the focus on console games. Do I need to get down there? Oh, yes, I do. Okay. There we go. Cool. As we saw with SimAnt, like as we saw with the SNES version of SimAnt, I think the focus on those kinds of games was on making good-looking game, on making a game that had really cool graphics, it had really sumptuous graphics. Like, the graphics were wonderful. They were really very colorful, very vibrant. It was a great-looking game. This game's graphics are more plain, and yet this game feels more engaging to me because it's more focused on the gameplay and it's less focused on being a good-looking game. I think that's probably part of the DOS sort of gaming cultural ethos or value system, if you will. It's a mousetrap, isn't it? Can I? Yep. Yeah, mousetrap killed me. Game over. Oh no. Game over, man. You see what I mean? These DOS games just tend to be more focused on the actual act of playing the game. They're not as concerned with making games that look good or sound good. And that often resulted in games that were very ugly. But those, ugly games were still sometimes a lot of fun. I don't know if I would say that it was the ugliness of DOS games that made them interesting. Like, I wouldn't say it's specifically the ugliness that I wouldn't say specifically the games appealed because they were ugly, but I would make an analogy with people and say, how sometimes you see people who are very successful in life, let's say, but they're not very physically attractive. I'm not saying that being physically unattractive is a benefit necessarily, but if you're physically unattractive, that shows that you had to rely on something else. People who are physically very beautiful, most of the time, can rely and often did rely on their good looks to get them ahead in life. And why not? If you know that people will be nice to you, if you know that people will give you nice things in life just because you're physically good looking, then sure, why wouldn't you do that? And a lot of people do that, obviously. So that if you look good, that you can do something like that. You can maybe get more things from people just because you're good looking. If you're not good looking, you can still be successful, but you have to rely on something else. You have to rely on your ambition or your intelligence or your personality or whatever. And so I think the same kind of thing holds true for DOS games. An NES game or an SNES game would just look cute, and people would play it just because they'd like how it looks. A DOS game couldn't necessarily do that. Well, later DOS games could. Later DOS games had nice VGA graphics, and they started looking really nice, and they started being able to carry themselves just based on the graphics alone. But at least early DOS games had to have good gameplay. They were forced to have good gameplay because they had cheap-looking graphics, and they couldn't rely on sumptuous graphics to sell themselves as an appealing game to play, if that makes sense. So, I wouldn't necessarily say that games looking bad were an advantage for DOS games, but at least the lack of graphical capability of early PC games meant that DOS games had to be fun to play because they couldn't sell themselves based on looking good or sounding good. Um, but also you had stuff like, gosh, if I go into Windows, so let me go into Windows quickly here and run something like, why did it suddenly quit? That's interesting. That's interesting. I lost mouse control. For some reason, my mouse stopped working in DOSBox. That's interesting. That's a first for me. Let's restart DOSBox and try this again. Let's see. File run. Okay, that looks better. What was the game? I think I put it in Ned's World like that, but I think the exe is called nedworld.exe. Oh. That's interesting. Was not expecting that. I probably should have checked this before starting this video. I thought that I had the files for that already there. Is it actually missing something? I guess it is. That's unfortunate. Because Ned's World is actually a game that that I wanted to show. It's a game that always comes to my mind when I think about unique sort of games, the games that were uniquely sort of that had a unique premise, because it's a game about training a neural network, and so it has obviously very strong sort of connections with the current sort of AI scene. And even though this is AI as it was like 30 years ago, I am just trying to see if I can find another copy of this game to download now. Sorry, I should have really tested this before starting the video, but I was sure that this was working. I thought I'd played this before, so now it's not working now. Very bizarre. And it's not a very well-known game either. That's the thing. So it's like it's one of those games which is hard to hard to find online because it's not a well-known game. Huh. I can't even seem to find it. Hold on, what is it saying? What file was it missing? I wonder if that's a comdlg.dll. Oh, is it maybe wanting Windows 3.1? It might be that it wants Windows 3.1 and I'm here on Windows 3.0. Let's try that then. Let's go ahead and go to Windows 3.1 and try this again. I'm running this on a higher res, got a really super high res version of Windows 3.1 here. Okay, let's see. Let's try running it here. Hopefully, maybe it'll work here. Yeah, okay. That's why it wasn't working. It needs Windows 3.1. It will not run in Windows 3.0. Okay, fine. So, Ned's World, shareware version 1.0, done by David S. Smichek from Louisville, Texas. Or Louisville, Texas. So, the premise of the game is fairly simple. You are Ned, and where is Ned? Oh, I think that's him there, this little sort of thing there. And Ned is supposed to collect food, which is these little green and black dots. And so you need to instruct him what to do. He's stuck on this wall, and the question is, what do you want him to do? Now, we know, we as humans can see that there's food right here. So we could have him turn around this way and start heading off towards the food. But the thing is, then, if we make him do that, then he's going to want to do that every time. Then he's going to want to say every time, turn right 90 degrees and just keep going until you find food. Is that always a good idea? Is that always a good thing to do? Probably not. But let's see now. If we, come on. How do I get him to... He appears to be... Oh, come on, he's almost there. He's almost at the food there. There we go, he found some food. Yeah, he doesn't really know what to do, so you need to train him. And this thing here, this thing with these light bulbs kind of shows his brain state. I have no idea how it works, honestly. I have no concept of how this game works at all. It's poorly explained, in my opinion. The documentation doesn't really explain how the logic really works. It explains the interface, but not really how the actual neural net logic works. But you understand, again, I hope that my point here is clear. This is not really about this specific game. It's just about the idea that this is the kind of game that tended to be made for PCs. Obviously, this is not a DOS game. This is a Windows 3.1 game. But the concept is the same. When is this game from? What year was this? 1993. There you go. So... this is the kind of game that started being made as we expanded into more GUI territory. Obviously, this is a Windows game. It's meant to be played with the mouse. It's not really keyboard propelled. It's a mouse propelled game. And this sort of opened us up to a more... I don't know if I should say more... I'm trying to think of an adjective here. Not necessarily more analytical or more, again, not necessarily more intelligent, but it is the type of game that was more aimed, I think, at people who worked in offices. This is obviously not a kid's game. This is not really something that children would probably have much interest in. This is very much a game aimed at adults who had more powerful computers that were more capable of running games like this. So again, do you see what I mean? Even though this is a Windows game and not a DOS game, I think that this sort of falls into the same category. I feel like Windows 3.0 and 3.1 games also count within that sort of culture of DOS gaming, because even though Windows is pretty different from DOS, it has a different look and feel from DOS, the culture, the human culture surrounding this operating system, if you will, or this GUI, if you wish, is something that sort of goes in that same direction. It's about making games that are more analytical. It's not about making action games. It's not about making games that look good. This game certainly doesn't have nice graphics. It certainly is not, again, it has zero audio. So it's not a great looking or sounding game. It's not an action game. It's not an exciting game. It's kind of a cerebral game. And I think this is, again, like what I'm trying to get is, I feel like this is the kind of game that would be made for that whole PC catch it. It doesn't matter that it's not a DOS game. It kind of falls into the same idea. And another example of this, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Another example which may be kind of significant to some people who watch my channel is what's the EXA name? Is it like, yeah, there we go. People still sometimes ask, even though I made a video explaining this years ago, I made like more than 20 years ago, I made a video explaining this, but people seem to, not more than 20 years ago. What am I talking about? More than, let's say more than 15 years ago. More than 15 years ago, I made a video explaining this, but people don't seem to know this. My name that I use on the internet, Late Blight, comes from this game. It's a plant disease management game. It's not even really a game. Like, calling it a game is a little bit, stretching it a little bit. But if we go ahead and say run the game, I need to choose a weather file name. So we can choose cool wet weather, hot dry weather, moderate dry weather, moderate wet weather, or moderate moderate. So not too cold or hot and not too wet or dry, just in between. So let's do moderate moderate. I made the same video about this game like years ago, but people have forgotten. So let's go and do it again. So if we click on this arrow here, this advances us through the growing season of our potato crop. And that green line that you see going up there is our leaves. I don't know what LAI is. Leaves something? I don't know. If you turn on these other things here, like this is obviously the temperature in degrees Celsius, rainfall millimeters, hours where the rain, RH, I believe is relative humidity, hours where the relative humidity was greater than 90%, and of course new infections because the game is about late blight infections, late blight being a potato disease, like it's a crop potato disease. And basically, this is the game, just kind of watching things develop here as you go throughout the growing season. And you can manage things. You can say under management, you can choose to spray systemic or protectant. You can choose how many kilograms per hectare. Do the economic. Oh, I don't know where this is grayed out. Don't ask me. You can. I think these are things you can't change once you've started the game. Change the resistance level, the harvest season. So I mean, it's a pretty simplistic game. It doesn't have super in-depth gameplay mechanics, but how many games about plant disease management have you seen for the Commodore 64 or the Apple II? Of course, they could have been made. Of course, they could have existed, but the PC enabled. And especially going into Windows, because this is the kind of thing where you'd probably want to have a GUI. This would not work very well for a DOS kind of thing. So this kind of game, coming into the Windows era, this is the sort of game that would work well for people who have Office PCs that run Windows. I don't know how many people played this game back in the day. This is from 1990. Obviously, this game has a very niche audience. It's not a game that was played by millions and millions of people. But this is the kind of game which I think illustrates what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is these were games that were creative. These were games that were not afraid to do something really different because obviously there were not a lot of games that did this. And yet, again, there's no graphics. This picture of a little sprout is the only graphic in the game, other than this line chart. And again, there's absolutely no audio. I just realized also that you can't see the thing that I was clicking on. Sorry, let me just adjust this quickly. This thing here at the bottom, this is your growing season. So you move to the right, and as you move to the right, that advances the growing season. You can see the effects of going through the growing season on the chart as the game advances. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of game that I think defines PC gaming because it's a totally new concept. It's a totally different concept. It's unlike anything that I've ever seen in any other game. But it definitely relies on the GUI sort of, the Windows interface, the Windows environment. This is not the kind of game that you could really have made for the Commodore 64. So again, it's partly about platform limitations. Obviously, the Commodore 64 had a much lower resolution, so it couldn't have rendered these kinds of graphs in such high resolution detail. But I think we can all agree it's not just a graphical thing. This game would not have been made for the Commodore 64, not just for graphical reasons alone, but also for reasons of the gaming subculture that existed on the Commodore 64. So I hope that my point is clear. I know that I haven't necessarily made the point very well. I know that I haven't necessarily explained myself very well, but I hope that what I'm trying to say is clear here. It's about the kinds of people who, first of all, the kinds of people who had these computers in the first place, because there's a different sort of demographic which would have a Commodore at home as opposed to having an IBM PC at home. But also it's about the different demographics that would play games on these different platforms. There is a certain demographic that liked to play and still likes to play DOS games, which is a different demographic from people who like to play Commodore 64 games, or NES games. Those are all very distinct, very separate cultures. There's not necessarily much overlap between them. For me, to some extent, there is. I personally very much enjoy comparing different versions of games. I actually really enjoy comparing Apple versions of games with Commodore versions of games, with PC versions of games, with Amiga versions of games. Um, but I think most people don't care that much. I think most people just would rather play the game in whatever platform they're most comfortable with. If you grew up with the Amiga, then you probably just want to play Amiga games. The Amiga was something similar, by the way. The Amiga actually, of course, was made by Commodore. It was from the same company as the Commodore 64. The Amiga was also, it was certainly a powerhouse of graphics and audio. The Amiga had great graphical and audio capabilities. But for that very reason, most Amiga games ended up being games that showcased its nice graphics and sound. They were mostly games that existed just because they looked great and sounded great. They were not games that were very creative in terms of their gameplay or very cerebral in terms of their concept, if I may be allowed to say so. So the point here is that, you know, how many Commodore 64 games were not in some way action based? Of course, there were some, but most Commodore 64 games were basically action games, and you see that reflected when Gemini does Double Energy episodes. It's mostly action games. It's mostly silly action games, which are not bad. Like I'm not. I don't have anything against the Commodore 64. It was a great computer, but most of the games that were made for it were kind of similar action games. There were not a lot of games which, at least to me in my mind, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I can't think of a lot of Commodore 64 games that really stand out in the way that games like Late Blight does, or in the way that, you know, even something like Aldo's Adventure. Again, Aldo's Adventure is just it's a blatant ripoff of Donkey Kong, and yet it's the kind of game that would not have been made for any other platform. It would not have been made for in that form, at least. It would not have been made in that form for the Commodore 64 or the Amiga or the Apple II. Um, so I think I'm getting close to the end here, but I do want to close off by talking about the Mac a little bit, um, because I said I would come back to the Mac, and having just shown Windows. Here, I have to give credit to the Mac. And people always talk about how Microsoft stole the idea of the GUI from the Mac. That might be true, but both of them stole it from Xerox. Of course, the Xerox Alto had GUIs long before the Mac existed. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I'm not a Mac user, and I never have been one. I've always kind of disliked the Mac just because of how it stole the market from the Apple II. But if you're not familiar with the history of how the Mac did that, of how the Mac sort of usurped the whole market from the Apple II, in 1984, when the original Mac came out, the Apple II was mostly a computer for schools or for hobbyists. Like I said, the Apple II was very popular in schools. It was very prominent on the education scene. It was very often used in school classrooms and for educational software, which is great. But that's a kind of a limited market. I mean, it's not a bad market, but it's a market with limited scope, I would say. Um, and other than that, people who had Apple IIs at home were mostly hobbyists. They liked to hack on the Apple II. They liked to, kind of get deep into the guts of the computer and do programming in assembly language or whatever, stuff like that. But it wasn't really a computer for serious adult business users. And that's why Steve Jobs favored the Mac, because the Mac, released in 1984, was more targeted at serious business users. For various reasons. It had a relatively high resolution at the time. It had what did it have? A 512 by 342 pixel screen. Yeah, that's a weird resolution, isn't it? 512 by 342 pixels, which was relatively high resolution for the time. I mean, in 1984, that was a relatively high resolution. That did make it a good kind of computer for certain types of office work, obviously. It was for certain types of productivity work, but also for certain types of games. And in fact, this is significant to me. The Mac was the second computer after the IBM PC to get a release of Microsoft Flight Simulator. The original Microsoft Flight Simulator, which was released for the IBM PC in 1982, was, it was for DOS. But Microsoft did follow up with a Mac version of Flight Simulator in 1986. And that is significant because Microsoft Flight Simulator did not get a release on any other computer platform. So, because I want to give credit where it's due, again, I hate the Mac because of what it became. But I will not deny that the original Mac in 1984 was a decent machine, and it encouraged the same sort of creativity, which I think allowed game developers to let their creativity sort of run free in a way that wasn't necessarily possible on some other platforms. I'm going to go ahead and run Mini VMac. Yeah, that sound effect might be familiar to some people. Let me go ahead and switch the window again. Here we go. This is Mini VMac, which is one of the preeminent Mac emulators for Windows. Let's go ahead and run Microsoft Flight Simulator. There we go. By the way, if you want to look for Microsoft Flight Simulator for Mac online, you can find it on the internet. I found it on the internet, but I found it only as Stuffit files, which have an SIT extension. Stuffit was to Mac as zip was and is to DOS and Windows. So, on the PC, zip is standard. On Mac, Stuffit or SIT files were standard back in the day. So what I did, there is a version of Stuffit Expander for Windows. And so I just downloaded Stuffit Expander for Windows, and with that I was able to extract the Stuffit file and get the disk image file that I'm using to run Flight Simulator here on the Mac. Now, let's go ahead and just run Flight Simulator here. Now, first of all, listen to that audio. Let me just turn it up a bit. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? So again, let's give credit where credit is due. Several things about the Mac irk me. One thing that I don't like about it is it's obviously monochrome. It seems really, really stupid to me to have made a monochrome computer in 1984 when the Apple II already could do color. The Apple II, most people think the Apple II is monochrome because it's shipped with a monochrome screen by default. But if you hooked up the Apple II to your TV, it's running a demo because I was talking too long and started doing a demo. Okay, that's fine. Actually, the demo is good because it'll fly the plane automatically while I talk. Now, look at what we have here. You can see it's pretty simplistic. The graphics are pretty primitive. It's not super high high detail. But again, this is a game from 1986. And you had on the Mac, like I said, the one thing that's very obviously stupid about the Mac is that it's a black and white screen. It seems patently stupid to make a black and white computer in 1984 when you already had color on the Apple II, which preceded it. But, again, this was a serious business machine. That's why Steve Jobs wanted to sell it, because the Apple II is not making a lot of money. The Mac was supposed to be a big money maker because it was targeted at serious business users. And in retrospect, I have to admit he was right. I mean, I hate his decision to focus on the Mac, but I understand why he did it, because he could make more money selling Macs than Apple IIs. So yeah, the fact that it's monochrome is unfortunate, but like I said, the resolution is higher. It has higher resolution graphics than what you could have done with an Apple II, at least with the original Apple IIs. It was mouse-driven, which is good and bad. It's good for some things, bad for some other things. I tend to not like mice on computers, but I can't deny that the mouse focus of the Mac enabled it to do some things which would not have been possible with other computing platforms at the time, certainly. It certainly had good audio capability. I mean, compared to the audio capabilities of the PC, the PC with its squeaky beeping, PC speaker, you heard like quite clear digital audio of the plane's engine. It was basically the same sound effect as on the PC, later PC versions of Flight Simulator 5. DOS versions of Flight Simulator wouldn't have that sound effect until Flight Simulator 5 came out, which was in the early to mid 1990s, I think. When did Flight Simulator 5 come out? When did Flight Simulator 5 come out? Hold on, let me check. Microsoft Flight Simulator 5. I want to say it was probably like 93, but let's see. It was around... It was around 1983, but let me check the exact year. Microsoft Flight Simulator 5 was released in 1994. Okay, so it wasn't until 1994 that PC versions of Flight Simulator had that kind of digital audio, digital sound effects. Until then, it just used a square wave played with the PC speaker. And this game's from 1986. That means the Mac version of Flight Simulator had digital audio 8 years before the PC did. What can I say? That's significant. Again, I'm not a Mac person, but it is what it is. Like I don't like to admit it because I'm more of a PC person, but I will deny the Mac was not a bad machine for its time. It was a computer that sort of stimulated people's creativity and let a lot of people like it because it did sort of allow more right-brain people to exhibit and exert their artistic creativity in a way that PCs maybe didn't. So yeah, so there's that. I mean, what can I say? Like I said, I'm not a Mac person. I've never been a Mac person, but I see stuff like this, and I can't deny that the Mac certainly had its impact. There were certainly things that it was good at. There were certainly things that that it did very well, probably better than any other computer at the time. And I have to respect it for what it could do. If you want to play Flight Sim on the Mac, one big question. Oh, hey, it's Meigs Field, the default airfield for like every version of Flight Simulator since forever. I think Microsoft changed that later, but anyway, if you want to play it, the big question that I had was how to control the throttle. Allegedly, plus and minus on the keyboard are supposed to work, but I couldn't get that to work. What you do is you hold on. Let me see. Can I actually? Yeah, the problem here is, see, it says click the close box. The problem here is Mini VMac does not show the mouse cursor in this program. I don't see the mouse cursor. I'm going to do this. I'm going to press Control-Alt-F, and now it's full screen. Now I can see my mouse cursor. I'm hoping, the question is whether you can. I guess you can. Okay, cool. All right, so Control-Alt-F makes it full screen. Now I can click the close box and press P to fly the aircraft. So the question is, how do you control the throttle? You can control the flaps with the square bracket keys. So you can do that to lower the flaps. That's nice. I can press L to turn on the lights. So those are the keyboard keys, but how do you control the throttle? Like I said, plus and minus are supposed to work. They don't work for me. What I ended up doing, the only way that I found to work, is click on mouse cursor here, and that makes it mouse yoke. And now you can see what I'm doing. I'm actually controlling the yoke with the mouse. I'm controlling the ailerons and the elevators with the mouse. What you can also do is if you hold the mouse button, hold down the mouse button, that lets you adjust the throttle. So hold the mouse and push the mouse up, and that lets you go full throttle. How to turn off the brakes? There you go. Period, just as on the PC. Press the period to turn off the brakes. And hey, we are rolling. Rolling, rolling, rolling. Keep that Cessna rolling. Let's see, can I take off at some point? It would be nice if I could take off. I guess I need to be going a little faster. I'm going slowly because my flaps are lowered, I guess. Okay, here we go. Those flaps will give us more lift. So we've lifted off. Hey, check it out. Now I'm flying. I'm flying with the mouse. I think flying with the keyboard is also possible, but flying with the mouse is actually surprisingly comfortable. I hate flying with the mouse on the PC, but here it is not too bad. It's probably more comfortable than flying with the keyboard, at least on this version of Flight Simulator. Okay, let's go ahead and... Oh boy. I should have... There we go. Okay. That's Flight Simulator for the Mac. Like I said, I'm not a Mac fan, but this is pretty cool. It is pretty cool. And you saw also for other flight simulators, I mean, like another very venerable flight simulator that came out later was F-19 Stealth Fighter. Again, best known for DOS, but F-19 Stealth Fighter did have a release also on the Amiga and the Atari ST, but not the Commodore 64. Probably the kind of game that you couldn't really have made for the Commodore 64. Certainly not with the same level of fidelity. So, in the end, you know, there are a lot of things that go into a culture. I mean, if you think about human cultures, they're very complex things. They're not simple. They're not one-dimensional things. But you know, there are little hallmarks and little symbols that that kind of show you, kind of give you clues about the mentality behind the things. One thing that very clearly, I think, in my mind, sort of reflects Commodore's mentality was the fact that nearly every Commodore 64 game requires a joystick. On the PC and on the Apple II, joysticks were optional, and most games didn't use them by default. But on the Commodore 64, it's just the opposite. Most Commodore 64 games require a joystick to play. You don't get a choice. You can't play with the keyboard. And again, this just kind of, it reflects the culture of the machine. It reflects the whole mentality that goes behind making game for the machine. It's not just a technical function. It's not just the technical difference of having a joystick instead of a keyboard. The decision to use a joystick as a main mechanism of controlling the computer reflects a different sort of culture and a different sort of mentality that goes into making games on that platform or just using that platform the everyday. So, in the end, I return to my original point that it's all about culture. It's all about the sort of the mentality, the set of values and ideas that go into making games and playing games. And whatever interests people who like DOS games, whatever brings people to my channel and also to Gemini's channel, is going to be something different from what you'll see in in most games for the Commodore 64, for the Apple II, for the Amiga, for the NES, for the Mac, for the Atari ST, whatever. And it's probably best to stick to, again, if you already have a successful YouTube channel, it's probably better to stick to your core audience, know what your audience likes and stick to what pleases them, and don't try to branch out into new things which will just kind of confuse people or leave them feeling a bit... I don't want to say alienated. That's maybe too strong a word, but at least it will leave them feeling like they don't have the same connection with your content that they used to have. So I'm going to try and stick with DOS content as much as possible. I'm going to show stuff like this as well. I mean, I think that people who like DOS games will probably have been entertained by seeing Flight Sim for the Mac. If you like DOS games, I think what you've just seen in this Flight Sim here was probably also entertaining to you, but it probably would be less entertaining to show a Commodore 64 game like, what's an example of I don't know, think of any popular Commodore 64 game. It just wouldn't appeal the same way. It wouldn't appeal to the same people or the same audience. So, and that's just a cultural thing. There's no way to really fix that. It's not a matter of the games themselves so much as just the whole sort of mentality behind the platform, behind the computer as a computer, as a platform. So that's all I wanted to say. That's my little spiel for today on the culture of PC gaming, especially DOS and Windows 3.1, 3.0 gaming. I guess that's it. Thank you for watching, everyone. Take care of yourselves. Hope that everyone's doing well, and I will talk to you all later. I'm at a point in my life where I'm probably not going to be able to make videos for a while, so I probably will be quiet for some time now. I'm probably not going to make a lot of videos after this for a while, but just want to leave this behind before I disappear for a little bit. So again, thanks for watching, everyone. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you at some point again in the future. Ta-ta for now, everyone.